Considering how much time and effort the show spent to building Belos up as this threatening, menacing villain, keeping him cloaked in the shadows for so long, and then demonstrating with such ferocity and intensity and dark, Stygian dread how horrifying a villain he could be, it's quite surprising that he's killed off so quickly and so abruptly. Now, you could say that he is not technically completely dead because that ooze, that slime that became of him after his death is still crawling around. And, of course, that will come into play later in the show. It is quite inauspicious and foreboding that the last shot we get of Season 2 is that little slime closing the door. But if that is considered being alive, that is a pretty paltry excuse for life. It is only a fraction of his essence that remains stamped on these lifeless things, to quote Shelley. He does not have a lot of options going forward. And to even consider his options would be to take for granted that he is still a consciousness with the ability to make decisions, or even have a real self, and that is seriously in doubt. The side of Belos that could plan, that could scheme, that was cunning and thoughtful, that could intellectualize his ambitions, that side of himself is gone. And because of that, I think it is pertinent that our focus turn more toward the Collector, who is positioned to take Belos' role as the final villain for this last stretch of the show. The Collector, this anarchic, wild-minded, capricious child who does whatever he has the immediate desire to do, even when it requires warping the world to fit his whims, even if it requires harming people who are in the way of those whims. Belos is, if not a tragic figure, then at least a pitiable one. He lost the opportunity to form new connections with others because he refused to open himself up to the idea that witches were not entirely evil. Because to do that would mean questioning the foundations of his existence, which are built on witch hunting. These foundations and the values that go with them have cost him so much. They've cost him his brother. First his brother's love and affection, and then finally his brother's life itself, as it appears that Belos killed his brother in a duel that resulted from his brother falling in love with a witch. And now Belos is armed only with spite, only with malice, only with a resentful bitterness that comes from his lack of connections and the contracting of his worldview to this one ambition that he monomaniacally pursues. Hannah Arendt talks a lot about how fundamentalist movements can arise in part because of the deterioration of social fabric, the breaking apart of communities and relationships that leave people isolated and lonely with no real strong connections in their lives, no sense of a whole, no sense of a basic foundation or root system that they can use to ground themselves. So they allow themselves to be swayed by these fundamentalist ideologies that provide this grand narrative, and thus this release from that terrifying malaise-invoking loneliness. Sartre makes a similar argument in his brilliant The Portrait of an Anti-Semite. He talks a lot about how bigotry and fundamentalism are appealing in part because they can provide a firm shield against having to reconsider your own perspectives, because they can provide insulation against having to engage in good faith with the fundamental questions of being, with the fundamental questions of their own existence and their own will in this world. if you have this fundamentalist framework, then all the answers are clear. You know who your enemies are. You know that your suffering is a result of them. And you commit yourself tirelessly to defeating them and stamping them out. That becomes an ontological goal. But this is, of course, nonsense. You cannot act in good faith and rest on these simple and easy answers that do not provide any real clarification to the serious questions of life. They don't explain why you're suffering. They don't explain why there's such a vast gulf between who you want to be and who you think of yourself as. It doesn't help you form a real core of the self. It's just a hiding away and escape from these challenging questions of being itself. Blaming a group is easy. Ascribing all your failures and psychological sufferings onto that group is easy. Now, Sartre is talking more about flaming, passionate hatred and loathing than just the stoic, stone-cold dogmatism that characterizes Belos, but the same dynamics apply. And it's unfortunate because Belos does demonstrate at least a real interest in Luce, especially in King's Tide. His words to Luce there strike me as largely sincere. Part of him does want to form a connection with her, and if he had not been so consumed by his witch-hunting ambitions, a connection like this would have been possible. It would have likely been beneficial to both him and Luce. For him, it would have stopped him from feeling as alone and as isolated and as deracinated from any sense of purpose and meaning. And for Luce, it would have given her a mentor who would, of course, not take the place of, say, Ida or her own mother, but who would nonetheless teach her about what it means to navigate between these two worlds and adjust to being in the Boiling Isles. But he clings to these grandiose narratives that ostensibly explain the world to him and thus prevent him from actually having to engage with the messy chaos of the world itself, which is unpredictable and constantly changing. Now, contrast this against the Collector, who seems to be entirely different. He has no moral convictions. He has no ostensible values. He does not really seem to have any desire to put one in peril unless they have actively wronged him, but he does not really care if he is harming others. And of course, when he is acting against Belos, his actions are brutal and decisive, and it's not entirely clear that he grasps the consequences of them. Now think of this from the perspective of someone fighting against these antagonists. If you're fighting against Belos, that's perhaps a little less humiliating because you're fighting against someone who has a core ethos, a core locus of desires and values that he is seeking to fulfill, and you're seeking to stop him from fulfilling those desires because of your own desires arising from your own values. But for the Collector, nothing similar is applicable. His caprices are those of an uncaring deity looking at a world as a toy. He has no real longings aside from playing to satisfy his constant appetite for action and sensory engagement. And if he is prevented from doing this, he will act quite violently and aggressively against those who stop him. And that he is not actively malevolent in the same way that Belos is does not make him any less of a villain. Villainy is not about being actively malevolent. If that was the case, there would not be a lot of villains, because there aren't a lot of actively malevolent people out there, and yet there are quite a few villains. People who can affect quite a magnitude of wrong. because that can be as simple as just following the orders you're given, or just doing whatever you feel like. It doesn't require this demonic sense of values that are completely opposed to the values of good and respectable and moral society. The Collector is absolutely a villain in this latter sense. He might not mean to be as destructive and fatal to the lives of so many people as Belos, but his caprices lead him in that direction nonetheless, and because of that, Belos' decision to keep him locked up was absolutely the right one. You can view this as a betrayal of the Collector, but considering the amount of destruction the Collector can cause, it was to the safety and security of the Boiling Isles that the Collector was imprisoned in the first place. This is, of course, not to imply that Belos cares about the well-being of the people of the Boiling Isles. Considering what he was going to do to them on the Day of Unity, he very clearly doesn't. You could say that from a Kantian perspective, it was not the right decision to keep the Collector locked up, that doing so was not a good in of itself, as it required forcing the Collector to operate under false pretenses. But abandoning Kant for a second and looking at a larger view of what the Collector is capable of doing unintentionally or otherwise when he is set free, I don't think a lot of us can be too angry at Belos for keeping the Collector locked up, whatever his reasons might have been. Without that imprisonment, the Collector can rage wildly, warping and twisting the world however he pleases to fulfill his desires. And that is a truly scary thing indeed. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see more videos like this. Keep watching The Owl House. It's a great show. And I can't wait to see how they ended in its last 3 episodes, which are most likely coming up at the end of this year. What do you think the Collector is going to do? What do you think of his overall belief system, or lack thereof? How do you think our team of heroes is going to stop them if they ever get back to the Boiling Isles and mount an offense against the Collector? Anyway, tune in soon for the next analysis. It will be coming soon, promise you that. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.